Chapter 8. Better by Air. Don McClure lost his balance and fell. He'd been standing on the top of his pulpit at a kobo, a 4-foot-high wooden box, and his back hit it as he slipped. His head cracked down on the cement floor. He lay there unconscious. He'd been using the pulpit to conduct physical exercises for the Anahuac schoolboys inside the mission church, because it had started to pour with rain outside. His vigorous demonstrations had tipped the box forward. When he recovered consciousness, he was in agony, thinking he'd broken his back. It took his wife Lyda and 2 other missionaries 4 days to get him to hospital at Malakal. The local rivers had been blocked by grass. The mission launch was tied up 10 miles away, only accessible through swamp and forest. Don was carried to it on a stretcher, slung high on the shoulders of 8 Anahuacs. Every step was excruciating. They started along the river in the launch, but after only a mile, it struck a large matted block of waterweed infested with crocodiles and snakes. They struggled through the night to clear it, until in the morning, local villagers helped them get free. 2 miles later, the process was repeated. Having lost a day and a half, they eventually arrived at Malakal. From hospital, Don wrote again, "Never did we need a plane more." Red-headed, rash and religious was the title of a book about Don and his work as a missionary. So far as it went, the description was spot on. But there was a lot more to Don than that. In 1950, when we first met him, he and Lyda were working among the Anahuac tribe, who lived partly in the Upper Nile province of the Sudan and partly over the border in Ethiopia. An experienced missionary, Don had initiated an imaginative outreach plan called the Anahuac Project. The aim was to establish a self-supporting, self-propagating Anahuac church within 15 years. The Anahuac language had to be reduced to writing, then the Bible translated and the people taught to read it. Evangelists and pastors had to be trained. To cope with the famines that regularly swept through the country, agricultural development had been started and schools and dispensaries were already functioning. Ultimately, the Anahuac themselves should be able to take over, and the missionaries could move on, pioneering new areas. Akobo, a remote government outpost, boasted an airstrip, though it was only a stretch of cleared and levelled cotton soil. Jack and I, informed that the landing ground was serviceable, flew there, dodging heavy rainstorms. We located it and landed safely. We were immediately attracted to Don. Life around him was never dull, and we learned much during our 2 weeks at Akobo. We were struck by the houses all the missionaries lived in. They were of similar materials and construction to the grass-roofed circular tukels of the Anahuacs. Each house was made of 3 wood and mud tukels, joined by thatched verandas. Culturally, environmentally, and financially, these struck us as better than the foreign type of house usually erected by missions. We saw quite a wide area during our visit. The rainy season had barely begun and trails were still possible, though only just. We travelled with Don and Lyda in an unforgettable introduction to work in southern Sudan. We were stranded by the roadside with the old mission jeep, 80 miles from Akobo. It was the latest of several mishaps since we'd left the mission station. After only half a mile, we'd had to stop to deal with water in the carburetor, a common problem in that humid atmosphere. 10 miles after that, we'd had the first puncture. The tyres were very vulnerable to the many big thorns along the track. Tubeless tyres weren't then available in Sudan, and good tyres were in short supply. Ours were very bad. A temporary lack of puncture repair materials hadn't worried Don much. it cheerfully resorted to the method used by the Arab traders. Cutting a patch from an old spare inner tube, he held it with a pair of pliers over the flame of our primus stove. When it was half melted, he zapped it swiftly over the hole, pressed it with his foot for a couple of minutes, and lo, it stuck. This was repeated almost every half hour after that, as new punctures appeared or old patches failed. All night we had slithered and stopped along the muddy trails, bleary from lack of sleep. With dawn, we'd found that the wall of one of the tyres had itself split wide open, and the tube was bulging out. Don was undaunted by this further challenge. He used a piece of zebra skin to make a gaiter inside the tyre, by no means the first time he'd been obliged to resort to such an expedient. That got us to our next stop, Peebaugh, where we were glad of a sleep in the government rest house. The simple little grass-thatched building had been provided for the use of the local British District Commissioner. His task was to administer and travel, often on horseback, an area the size of Wales. The government had already agreed to a mission station here, and a site for it had been chosen. It was vital to know whether an airstrip could be provided to give better access than was possible over land. So, we were glad to find a sandy patch which would make a reasonable all-weather landing ground. Another outpost could be established. Further on, we had to leave the jeep and cross a seasonal river by dugout canoe. We went on by foot to Puchala on the Ethiopian border. The unreached Merle people were there at that time. I didn't know then, but I would be in Puchala again a few years later, when we would fly a few missionaries to start a new work. On our way back to Akobo, we inspected several further areas. Another journey, another government outpost and mission station, another tribe. We were making for Nasser amongst the Nuas. Don had been unable to come with us. Lyda was our guide, and I was driving. This time we were using the McClure's big but well-worn Ford station wagon. We'd been travelling all day along the side of the winding Sobat River. En route we'd had trouble with the car overheating, and repaired a burst radiator hose with a roll of adhesive bandage. When darkness fell, we were only halfway to our destination, so we pressed on, our headlights swinging up and down on the uneven surface and reflecting off the walls of tall grass on either side of the trail. It was very dark, and the eyes of wild animals glinted occasionally as we disturbed their prowls. Otherwise, we could see nothing ahead beyond the limited range of our lights. "What's that?" I exclaimed suddenly. Just in front of us, the earth road rose sharply. Then we saw it was built into a ramp to lead up to a bridge. But there was no bridge, only a yawning gap, and beyond that, the river. I braked hard, then realized the brakes were not working. We discovered later they'd been fractured by scraping over the rough roads. Unable to stop, I instinctively swerved, turning the station wagon sharply to the right. We bumped off the track just short of the dark river ahead. But I had swung the wheel the wrong way. A great hole yawned before us, some 20 feet across and 8 feet deep. We lurched right into it. The car rolled over and lay on its side. Shaken but unhurt, we were able to get out. We looked at the hole and saw it had been made when soil was dug out to build the ramp. "This is what happens in Sudan," said Lyda philosophically. "You've seen it for yourselves. That's why we want a plane." The station wagon was too heavy to move, so we decided to wait for daylight to seek help. We lay down in the grass and went to sleep. Yes, we did sleep, though I remember hearing lions roaring in the night. Many wild animals roamed these areas. We were all badly bitten by mosquitoes. Early next morning, 20 Nua tribesmen came walking along the trail, spears in hand. They helped us push the car out of the hole. The engine started, and we piled in hopefully, but the car didn't budge. I found the drive key on the rear axle had sheared. We managed to find a 6-inch nail amongst some building materials in the car, and I was able to file a rough replacement. It eventually got us to NASA by mid-afternoon. The mission at NASA was different from the others we had visited. It wasn't a new location, having been there for 37 years, dedicated to the service of the Nua. It had a dispensary, 2 nurses, a doctor, an agriculturalist, separate boys and girls' schools, and a church. The Nua were an intelligent, independent, warlike and semi-nomadic people. Black as ebony, they were generally very tall and slim. I have a photo of Jack and Helen Hemmings next to some Nua men. Jack himself was a full 6 foot, but in the picture, Helen, sitting on his shoulders, had her head only just level with that of one of the Nuas. Life for the Nuas revolved around their cattle. Cows were needed to buy a wife. The number of cows owned was the measure of a man's wealth. They drank their milk. The men mixed cattle dung with ashes to plaster down their hair, bleaching and straightening it. The dung was also used in finishing and firing their clay pots, and was an essential ingredient in house construction. It strengthened the mud and made it more durable. Fascinating as we found all this, we soon learned that the Nua lifestyle had some dark undertones. Taboos and totems, constant fear of malevolent curses, sacrifices to ward off evil spirits and the evil eye. Theirs wasn't the happy and carefree existence it seemed at first sight. Like other outposts, NASA was very cut off, and the missionaries were keen to find an airstrip site. With Chuck Jordan, the mission agriculturalist, we tramped around the outskirts of the village and identified the driest area in the generally swampy countryside. Here was another situation in the Upper Nile province, where it was going to be better to travel by air. After our survey of the NASA and Akobo areas, we flew back westward to Malakal. The town was not much to look at. We'd been totally unimpressed when we'd called there 2 years earlier on our first trip out from London to Nairobi. But small and insignificant though it might appear, it was the focal point of the Upper Nile province, the centre of its administration and headquarters of the provincial government. The Sudan is the largest country in Africa. The Upper Nile province alone was the size of the UK. It's been divided into 2 since then. Imagine a single, small, sleepy, very primitive town at the centre of Britain. In terms of scale, that would represent Malakal. Imagine, too, every British hill flattened, leaving nothing but a vast, monotonous expanse of grassland, hot and dry for half the year, swamped by rain for the other half. That will give an idea of its surroundings. Malakal stands on the bank of the Nile, which flows through the whole length of the Sudan. It is exactly halfway along the course of the river, from its distant source in Uganda to its delta mouth in Egypt, 2,000 miles in each direction. The Nile is the main artery of communication in the south, and Malakal is one of the principal stopping places for its slow post boats. In those days, these wood-fired paddle steamers carried most of the mail, supplies and passengers to and from Khartoum and northern Sudan. They had passenger cabins on top and pushed a barge in front, with another at either side to give extra carrying capacity and stability. The province also had 2 steamers, smaller versions of the post boats, for more local use along some of the Nile tributaries in the region. As Jack, Helen and I flew back into Malakal, we were again dodging heavy storms. Torrential rain and wind-driven cumulonimbus clouds had only just moved away from the town itself, and the runway of the little airfield was still glinting with water. As we circled over the town and river, Jack, peering through the wet windscreen, suddenly tightened his grip on the control column. "Look at the river! One of the steamers has turned over." I looked and was horrified. The steamer's barges had broken away and were scattered in the water. The steamer itself had completely overturned and was floating upside down, the cabins underneath the water. As soon as we landed, we heard the tragic news. The wife of a British official and her daughter had drowned. So had a police officer who tried to save them. Travel by air had its dangers, but other travel methods could be dangerous too, even the safe-seeming steamers on the peaceful Nile. The river never seemed quite as innocent to me after that. In Malakal, we visited the provincial governor, John Winder, a British official of the Sudan Civil Service. He was interested to hear details of our survey and issued authority for the immediate clearing of airstrips at the places we'd explored with the McClures. We had one final area to visit before returning to Khartoum. It lay at Obel, just south of Malakal. There we sat on the shady veranda of the home of an English couple, Alan and Phyllis Webb, whilst Phyllis poured welcome cups of tea from a large teapot. We drank it thirstily after coming in from the glare and heat outside. Obel was a secluded spot in the bush where the River Sobat joins the Nile. Alan was headmaster of a teacher training school there. As the senior educationalist in his mission, he particularly wanted to visit similar schools among the Nuers at Nasser and the Anuak at Akobo. We were discussing how we could help him. Drinking tea with us was another Englishman, Mr. Meadows, the government education officer for the province. He was listening enviously to the plans being made. "I want to see the government let us officials fly by MAF too," he said. "Where would you want to go?" we asked. "I'd like to get into Doro and see the schools in that area." "That should be possible," we said. "It's less than an hour and a half's flying from Malakal." "Do you realise," said Meadows, "that if I wanted to go to Doro now, while the rains are on and the roads closed, I'd have to go via Khartoum and Rosiris. That would be a 1,000-mile surface trip compared with your 1.5 hours by air." Here were comparisons that would more than satisfy Murray Kendon's vision. Our survey had been very positive, the needs very clear, the contrast between land and air travel dramatic. There was none of the ambivalence revealed by the earlier Gemini survey. Missionaries were already pressing for bookings on the plane in every direction. The provincial governor and his officials wanted to use it too. But would the Sudan government let us operate in this difficult region? Would they lay down so many restrictions that it would be impracticable? In spite of everything, would we have to return to London again, unable to establish an air service, even in an obviously needy region? Would we, as had been predicted at the Mildmay Council meeting, once more come back with our tails between our legs? We had to return to Khartoum and await the government's answer.